Welcome to Making Democracy Work, brought to you by the League of Women Voters and Olelo. This is a monthly series on topics of community interest with distinguished experts. I'm Pearl Johnson with the League of Women Voters. I'm chair of the Planning and Transportation Committee. Today we're going to talk about the general election just passed. And we have with us Neil Milner, the retired professor of political science from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and Chad Blair, political reporter for Civil Beat, the online newspaper. Thank you both for being here.
Sure.
Would you like to tell me what you thought of the election?
Nothing very surprising and a little bit on the dull side with one exception, and that's the GMO in Maui, and we'll talk about that later. It was not a surprise in the sense that the polls had suggested in that direction, if not so much the polls here, but the experts on the mainland who do some fairly thorough stuff had it definitely leaning toward the Democrat for governor, and by the end it was the same for Congress, partly because the Democrats probably did a better job turning out votes, so the Republicans who have a harder job didn't do such a good job. They had a harder standards. Secondly, because the polls here, the people who usually do polls here, it tends over time, it's statistically biased in favor of the Republicans, not ideologically biased. If you look at over time the polls numbers and how they compare to the results, it tends to exaggerate the Republican strength.
Well, I would say, speaking of the Republicans, if you're a Republican in Hawaii, you can't be feeling very good right now. There was some hope for them. They thought that Mark Takai and Charles Dejoux were tied, and Dejoux's a very good candidate. And he came close, but not nearly enough. The Democrats clearly got out the vote. With Duke Aiona, there was the disappointment on a lot of his supporters that they were not able to register new voters like they expected to do based on the reaction to the same-sex marriage turnout last fall. Remember, that was folks saying, let the people vote, and we're going to remember in November that you wouldn't put this to a ballot question. Well, guess what? They didn't remember in November. They didn't turn out. So a big disappointment for Republicans, particularly when you consider what happened on the mainland.
Yeah,
That's right. I think that the same-sex marriage one, the Republicans always exaggerated the strength of that. First of all, because passion is having a relatively small group of passionate people is not the same as having a group of people actually voting. Secondly, the folks who are social conservatives and are involved with those churches tend already to vote Republican and probably are mobilized. It's very, very hard to take a group of people who happen to turn out for this one issue and translate that passion into the act of voting. If it was that easy, the League of Women Voters would have a much easier time when it comes to turnout. And so I think, and you top that off with the fact that the Republicans are at such an extraordinary disadvantage here in terms of the size of their base, that it isn't that they were being naive, really. It was that what they really had to do was something that was extraordinarily difficult to do, I would say virtually impossible to do.
In fact, it's something they've only done with Linda Lingle in 2002 and 2006. She came close in '98 against Ben Cayetano. She was able to do what no Republican has done in state history. You really can't include Bill Quinn back at the time of statehood, because he was in the appointed position when there was the territory, and then he became the elected governor, and before you know it, Jack Burns was in office. So they have to be demoralized, thinking, how are we ever going to get some representation? Even at the state house, nothing really changed in the Senate. It's still 24-1 Democrats over Republicans. They did manage to pick up one seat in the House. Ironically, a GOP candidate defeated Karen Awana, who actually voted against same-sex marriage.
Yes, and used to be a Republican.
And used to be a Republican, exactly. But she's had some campaign finance issues that I think folks finally wised up to.
I want to go back to your point about polls.
Yes.
Because people who answer polls are self-selected. I know when my husband answers the phone, he will not take a poll. And I'll say, I'll answer. And so I imagine that people who have been in Hawaii a long time are those who don't want to answer polls, and therefore pollsters have a hard time getting a real representative selection?
Well, I'm not sure that the specific reason you give about people living here for a long time is correct, but your general point is right, and this is what pollsters have discovered. They've discovered that over the years, the response rate is much lower than it used to be. I mean, the standard way you do it is you develop some kind of random sample, and you call the people in that sample, and you follow up if they don't answer. So one of the problems used to be cell phones. They weren't sampling for that. But even if you include that, and most of the polls now do, you still have a problem with a very, very low response rate, even if you call them back. What pollsters do is they have a variety of statistical techniques that are actually pretty good, far from perfect, but pretty good, that can take these limited ones and figure out and weight them in a way that makes them representative. And they do it that way. There are polls now called opt-in polls that really ask you to volunteer to poll. They say, look, you know, it's no different, that's no different than self-selection, and then they use
Right.
those statistical
Yeah.
tests. So, and they've been pretty good. The problem with polling here is probably not the sample as much as it is the infrequency. You don't get enough data points. That said, the polls seem to have overestimated overall. This is not a good year for polls nationally. They overestimated Democratic strength. But this is an inherent problem now in all polling, and it isn't going to go away. That is, you're not going to get more people to volunteer. You just have to figure out statistical techniques that you can do to adjust it. And as I say, they've moved in that direction, not too badly. The good ones all do it. Certainly you guys do it.
Well, we're
but it's hard.
trying, and
Yeah.
we're lucky that all the polls, the races that we polled this primary election in general, we got them all right. The Star Advertiser and Ward Research did very good with the general election. I think they actually nailed the Ige-Iona race, missed one or two in the primary. But you know what, I've been thinking about this. I actually wrote a column. I hate these polls. I mean, everybody talks about them, they make the news, but I feel for the candidates, because if you're in first place, you feel great, but you feel like someone's coming behind you, they're going to try and catch up. If you're close, that gives your people momentum to try harder. And then if you're in back of the pack, think of somebody like Mufi Hanneman, how he must have just felt. Well, actually, the polls were accurate. He never really got more than 11 or 12%.
But this isn't a surprise. They're doing their own private polls. There's, if you've got a decently funded campaign, if you take, for example, the mayoral race, you have better data, better poll data, not just on what the results say, but who's doing what, than any of these publicly hired pollsters do. Not that they couldn't do it, but you can't afford it. I mean, you could never afford to have that kind of day-to-day.
No,
working
it's
poll.
thousands,
so it isn't like,
$10,000s
right.
of dollars. Yeah.
It's not like Mufi Hanneman was suddenly surprised when it came out that he had, you know, basically two bowling teams supporting him.
Although I don't know if he even had enough money to pay for his own poll.
That's right.
I haven't looked at his latest campaign
To see if
finance
he hired a
statement,
pollster,
but
yeah.
he only raised about a couple $100,000. That's compared to David Ige, who raised well over $2 million, and Neil Abercrombie, who raised over $5 million.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about civil beats polls. Are they always, answered by touch tone on the phone, or do you have people?
They are answered by, it is an automated poll.
Right, yeah.
They use a mix of landlines and cell phones, and some have criticized that as not being as accurate as actually talking to a person. The plus side, people say, in favor of this system is that people sometimes are more truthful, more honest with a machine than they are with an actual human being, because there's a sense that somebody wants to sway the person on the other side to give them the right answer, if you will.
Here's what drives me nuts about the polls, since you mentioned you're not liking them. Every time you have the same response. Hawaii is difficult to poll, and then there's a set of reasons why. So I'm thinking, if my plumber says to me, I can't fix your toilet because it's difficult to fix, you know what I'm saying? So they've never really gotten outside of that box, which is one of the reasons I think that one of the ways you handle polling, and again, this requires money. The New York Times can do this, but the Civil Beat probably can't. You have a variety of pollsters doing it from a variety of ways. The New York Times now uses an opt-in pollster in addition to their regular ones, because there is safety in numbers, because then you can see who the outliers are. But that isn't going to happen here. But that Cracker Barrel sociology stuff just drives me up the wall, like the condition. You know, those local people, they're quiet. They don't like to talk about things. Well, I don't know how true that is, but if you're in the business of getting people to talk to you, shouldn't you try to figure out a way to do that?
Well, let me give you my personal opinion about taking a poll. I enthusiastically take polls, and the people who ask questions don't know how to pronounce Hawaiian names.
Yes.
They're hard to understand, and that's why I think Civil Beat, you have someone who the recording is at least I can understand.
We actually go and we phonetically map out Hanuman, Ige, Iona, because you're absolutely right. Any local voter is immediately turned off when they hear a mispronunciation of a name that everybody knows how to pronounce here. We also trying to have a voice that sounds like someone familiar, and we've tested this. We've tried a mainland type voice and a local type voice. Not as much different there, but boy, if you mispronounce, you're going to blow it.
So have you ever done any of the opt-in polls? Kaiser, for example, if you're a member of Kaiser, they may have asked you to join a panel. And essentially then you're opting in. So I opted in the YouGov thing. So every few days I get a thing that says, Dear Neil, they call you by your first name. Would you like to participate in this poll? And you get points, and the points get you merchandise.
Oh.
Yeah, which is what Kaiser does. If I'm in one of the Kaiser things, and I get points toward Amazon, and since I'm a compulsive buyer. So, but you don't have to participate. They'll send you the poll, and then they'll say, if you didn't do it, they say, well, we're waiting for your poll. And if you don't respond, then. But I take maybe one a week. They're fast.
yeah.
Sometimes they're on politics. If some of them are so wacky as far as my interests are concerned. But it's become part of the art, and the findings are pretty good. That they seem to be just about as accurate as any of the other polls.
Well, let's hope pollsters are listening, because I think that's one of the reasons Civil Beat's polls are successful, because you don't mispronounce Hawaiian names.
I can tell you we've actually spent a lot of time on this, and our two pollsters, the main two guys for the company, it's Merriman River Group for those folks at home. We work with them very closely. We're constantly refining. We've had people criticize us for sampling too many haoles and not enough Japanese, or vice versa, or too many conservatives and so forth. And we're still working at it. What's nice about our pollsters is they'll acknowledge it. We even have them write columns explaining how they do it.
Yeah.
And they consider the criticisms. And when we got one big poll wrong 2 years ago, the Mazie Hirono Ed Case race, our guys went back and looked at that and said, well, what did we do wrong? That's also the same year we nailed the Mufi Hanneman Tulsi Gabbard race. So I will add one other thing. It's either urban legend or there's some truth to it that older Japanese American voters in particular may be reticent in terms of taking polls or giving answers. And some link that to the internment camp experiences and the difficulties and whatnot. And so the feeling there is they always underestimate the real Japanese American turnout. Interestingly enough, a number of Japanese American candidates did very well. David Ige and Shansetsui for the governor in LG, and Mark Takai.
Have you ever seen any convincing evidence that that's right about him?
I've never.
It just fits the
anecdotal,
stereotype too much. The nails sticking up, all of that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's for sure.
Yeah.
As a
But
matter
we
of
do
fact, we
have other
asked-
things to talk about besides polls.
Oh, that's it. You've got me rolling on riding my hobby horse here. Yeah.
Okay, now, low voter turnout. Do you think that it's because so many of the races were not close at all? There were a few close races.
If you look at kind of overall statistical studies of what's associated with higher turnout and lower turnout, the couple of things that raise the turnouts are same-day registration. Not mail-in so much, same-day registration. There aren't many things that do, and competitive elections. But I think what you need is a tradition of competitive elections, and that we don't have here. People say, well, you had it this time. Voting is a habit, non-voting is a habit, and it takes time to develop each of those habits. So I think we don't know much more than we know about voter turnout in Hawaii, and that's because we spend way too much time moralizing about it and way too little time trying to figure out how you change it. Because everything we say about why you should vote, if you look at the studies of how that works, it doesn't work very well.
It's true. We generally do not have competitive races. There were two exceptions this year. The Schatz Hanabusa race for the U.S. Senate and Takai and Deju for Colleen Hanabusa's seat, the CD1 seat. And then, of course, there was the GMO ballot initiative and so forth. There are going to be some changes that are coming shortly. There will be
Yes.
registration. You can vote online, or register to vote online, I believe, will be coming in 2016. You probably already know this stuff because you work for the League of Women Voters. And then I believe by 2018, correct me if I'm wrong,
That's right.
same day, you can register on
that
election
day.
day.
Yes.
I hope it'll move the needle. My guess is it probably won't. You know, there was even something the elections office did this time. They had drive-by voting. You could actually go and almost like getting a cheeseburger and fill
Yes.
out. It's so easy to vote, but the reality is it has to be part of your tradition, your habit, your family's habit. Otherwise, you're just not going to change.
Yes.
Well, you know, I'm ashamed to admit this as a member of the League of Women Voters, but this drive-by voting, I didn't understand that.
It was an experiment. I don't know how many. I think they actually did get some people, but the numbers really
Where
did not
was that?
move. Oh, the election site had the office had a list of the places. There were a handful of them around the state. I don't have it right in front of me.
This was on election day?
No.
you can't
This
do
was.
it. It has
this
to be
was-
before
This
the.
was
Right,
the
yes,
early walk-in
yes,
period.
uh-huh.
The early walk-in period, and when the absentee
It wasn't
voting
very well
started.
publicized.
That is the thing, and they do not have a good budget there. They are actually going to
Yeah.
have to appropriate more funds in order to enable online registration and same-day voter registration. But maybe this will help move it a little bit. But you know what? It's so easy to do, to register to vote.
It's never
Yes.
going to move a whole lot at one time. That I don't care how many rules you change. It's taken a long time to drop. As I say, voting's a habit, so there might be an uptick. I don't think you can ever depend on the Office of Elections to have much of a significant impact, not because they're inefficient, because actually they finally ran this election pretty well.
That was one of the stories.
I know.
No complaints.
We didn't have,
Way to go,
I kept
Scott.
waiting for it, because when you're doing TV commentary and there's
Yeah.
all those hours to fill between printouts, it used to be something that you could talk
There
about.
was no 800 ballots on Maui suddenly materialized.
But it's a pretty small operation, and it's
It
not
is.
very proactive because they can't be very proactive. And so if you're ever going to try some of the things that seem to work, that are pretty labor intensive, it's not going to come from an office that doesn't have any labor.
Well, the League of Women Voters really tried to publicize all the places where you could vote on our website, lwv-hawaii.com. We had, you know, all of the places to vote, what the dates and all that. They never told us, at least that I'm aware, that there was going to be this drive-in voting, drive-by voting.
It caught me by surprise,
Yeah.
but they did
Yeah.
issue, if you were on their list of, like I'm in the media, right? So I get their press releases and whatnot. It generally surprised me, and I don't know how many, as I said, how many people actually took advantage of it. But I thought that was a novel idea. At least they were
Yes.
trying. But Neil's right. They don't have the extra staffing or the budget that's necessary for that.
Yeah.
But you know, the infantry way of changing votes is very labor intensive. By infantry, I mean it's virtually a door-to-door operation. If you look at the mail kinds of stuff, email stuff doesn't work. These
Yeah.
kind of blanket things. Mail maybe works a little better, but the best thing for uptick and turnout is face-to-face interaction. And the face-to-face interaction involves a certain kind of social pressure that's very similar to the social pressure you get when other people are trying to change your behavior, whether it's use of electricity or giving to charity. It involves telling people what your neighbors are doing, like your neighbors voted, here's a list, and you didn't. And then the
Oh,
next
yes.
the next step was essentially a shaming step. and where you
works
say,
here.
and they would say, and we're going to publish it after the election. So the first time they did this, I tell people, is this an academic exercise? I say, what you mean by that is obviously an insult, because I'm an academic. But no, this was actually, they had some academics put the study together, but this was done for a political campaign. It was done in an experimental way to see where it works. So they do the shaming side of it, and all of a sudden they're getting emails just blasting them for being bullies, and they finally say, we got to cut this part out. So they just stuck with the first part, and the numbers look pretty good, even by that. Essentially saying, you know what, you change your habits partially because of what role models do. But then they went back and looked at the data, and still the most effective bump, the largest bump in the turnout, came from the shaming side, from the early
Right,
stuff.
right.
So, yeah.
And where was this done?
Well, it's been done it's part of the term of art now in various places. I think this one, I'm trying, the League of Women Voters may have been involved in this. I may be getting it mixed up. The League of Women Voters was interested in this, and it was in Connecticut. Now, again, this is
yes.
in a book by Sasha Eisenberg, and they made sure that they stayed nonpartisan, that this was about turnout, it wasn't about one party, and they tested it out, and that's partly of, that's part of the findings. I am sure that this is partly what PRP did with all of that money. They had a very sophisticated grassroots campaign, and part of it is to target people that you are leaning toward you and making sure that they vote. And one of the ways to do it is this kind of face-to-face, sitting down. But it's hard to do. If League of Women Voters would have to recruit a whole lot of people.
Well, let's go to the big surprise of the election, which is the GMO initiative in Maui.
Well, as we speak, as expected, lawsuits have been filed on behalf of biotech companies that don't want this moratorium in place so that the county can study the effects on health of GMO crops. But it was an amazing night, just from an election standpoint, to see them up the opposition 19 points ahead at one point, and to finish 50 to 48, I think was the final count. Very dramatic. When all this money that came in, $8 million from the GMO pro side, if you will, and less than 100,000 on the part of really a very grassroots campaign that succeeded.
It's surprising because we don't really know much about why it happens, and one of the reasons we don't know much about why it happened is that it was a very difficult campaign for the media to cover, because it involved grassroots work, and the way you cover a grassroots campaign to see this in action is really to cover it from day to day. It's all about a lot of little small things going on. That takes a lot of time. From day to day, there isn't much payoff. There's not a big speech given. There's not a rally. And that's very challenging for most media outlets. It's impossible to imagine television doing it. It's possible to imagine, let's say, some kind of news magazine saying early on, anticipating this and saying going out and doing it. But the everyday working media folks are going to have a very hard time doing it. That's one reason. The second reason is that this was on the neighbor island, which makes it even harder for a lot of the local media to cover. There are a lot of interesting stories that came out of there, but the story of what was going on at the grassroots was clearly not as publicized as all of these ads.
And remember, Maui County is several islands, and so folks on Molokai, where the biotech industry employs hundreds, a lot of people voted against it because, frankly, they're going to be out of a job.
Yeah.
Maybe already are now that the lawsuits are, well, probably be an injunction of sorts.
Sure. Well, that's what they're hoping for,
That's the whole point. Whereas on Maui, it really was a door-to-door thing. And I imagine that we haven't seen the end of this. One wonders whether the legislature will finally have to get involved, given that the counties, with the exception of Honolulu, have been moving so aggressively on GMOs and pesticides.
When I first got into the political analysis business, and I didn't know a whole lot about what was going on in neighbor islands, on election night, if they would ask me, my default answer was, things are always different. Politics is much more face-to-face. Now that I know more, I still say the same thing, because now I know that what I was saying earlier in a kind of, shall we say, tentative manner is true. This is a kind of face-to-face, small-town, passionate politics that you never see in Honolulu, probably because of the size. I mean, I've done some conflict work in Kauai. Remember the airport runway stuff?
Oh, sure.
They sent a team of us over to run this town meeting, and I swear the entire island was there. It was really democracy at its, I mean, what finally solved that is the legislature didn't have any money to make it, but it's very different, and that's part of it. You see it in the city, in the county council races.
And what about the Honolulu charter amendments, the defeat of the preschool funding?
That's statewide.
That was a
yeah.
statewide. There were actually no city.
That's right,
There were
yes,
several
yeah.
on the neighbor island counties,
Right.
but in fact, the preschool funding was probably the other big story of the election. This would have allowed the use of taxpayer money for private preschool programs. Pretty solidly defeated. When you have the teachers union and David Ige, their candidate, against it, that probably didn't help. Remember, Neil Abercrombie had pushed for that constitutional amendment question for expanding preschool, and of course he was out of the picture, having lost in the primary.
It took the state 4 years to even get an enabling piece of work on this. And remember, in the last 4 years, we've really gone backwards on pre-K.
We
got
ended,
rid of the-
basically,
We ended
right.
pre-kindergarten. 40 states have this. Most of those states do it by a public-private partnership. The pioneer in this is one of the most politically conservative states in the country, which is Oklahoma. All of which makes me very skeptical about whether this state has the will or the capacity to delve into creating this kind of social program. The teachers union always made it sound pretty easy, that all you have to do is open up the space and start pre-K again. I've never seen the state, I mean, this is a state in which, we talked about this in one of the podcasts, the state is a pretty liberal state in how it votes. It's not such a liberal state if you look at social programs. And I think this is another example. It has a lot of trouble with introducing complex social programs. So I think whether you like the public-private partnership or you like the fact that it was defeated, I think what you've created is something that's going to take a long time to start.
The other amendment that was defeated was the judge's age.
It surprised the heck out of me for a state that reveres its kapuna. By an overwhelming margin, folks did not want to extend the retirement age for judges and justices from 70 into 80 years of age. And I thought that was a no-brainer.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, you don't, politicians are serving well into their 80s.
The two Senator Dans were re-elected when they were in their 80s.
Right, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So, oh yeah, it's a very, I mean, the dynamic about how we treat the elderly is very interesting, because when the pension tax came up, and I'm thinking, well, you know, remember that pension?
Oh,
I'm
yes.
thinking, well, maybe that makes a little bit of sense, that you don't see the elderly as a category of elderly. You see them like you see everybody else. Some can afford to pay a tax, others can't, and you have a progressive tax. It was as if being old was sacred there, right? So it seems to be sacred.
But just
for
don't keep them
everybody.
on the bench any longer.
Well, we're almost out of time, and is there something that you would like to say in about 20 seconds?
I'm just glad it's over. I mean, I hate to say it, 2016 has already started, and I'm hoping folks out there, just tell folks to vote next time. That's my one little preachy moment. Register, vote.
Yes.
No, I agree with Chad. I'm glad it's over, and I think people have to take a vacation from politics sometimes. And I think one of the ways to do it is to back away from cable television, to back away from the Sunday news shows, because there's a lot of noise on those shows, statistical noise, which means there's a lot of material there that's irrelevant. I'm fighting a losing battle, and that's a very personal thing, but that would be my message.
Well, thank you both.
Sure.
Neil Milner from the University of Hawaii at Manoa and Chad Blair of Civil Beat. I'm Pearl Johnson with the League of Women Voters. Thank you for watching.